Why do we feel like we have no control over our future? It's become easier for us to imagine living forever in colonies on Mars than reclaiming control over technology here on Earth. Platform companies now own the digital infrastructure of everyday life. They set the rules of the game and profit from our activity. When it comes to technology, we need to start talking more about power, ownership, and control. The problem with tech companies is that they're driven solely by profit. We can't fix them because they're doing exactly what they were designed for, increasing shareholder value. But we can make a change. Platform socialism is about liberating technology from capitalism. Platforms should provide public goods and deliver services that are free for all to use. They should be driven by values like fairness, accountability, and freedom. Communities should decide what kinds of technology gets developed and how it's used. The future is not inevitable. We need real democracy over technology so we can reclaim our digital future.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson, and joining us today is not Eduardo, not Hemma, not Kenny, not Alex. All my comrades have left me. But as you can see, I have a few guests here today. Number one is Bo, Bo from the Rust Belt. Bo is a fellow socialist. He had been in the ISO after I had already left, but both of us have known each other for years, kind of both talking about and complaining about the ISO, but also talking about our thoughts about Marxism and our reflections on our developing ideas about Marxism. So I've been wanting to have Bo on the show for a long time, and kind of finally he agreed. And you also see Vincent Kelly. Vincent has been on What's Left before. And he's a writer on Substack and does a wonderful job on what's called Handful of Earth. And he's currently pursuing his PhD in ethnomusicology at UPenn, although he's actually coming to us from India. So Bo, Vincent, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, so Bo, I've just been wanting to have you on for a while because you and I have just kind of occasionally just had these interesting sort of orbiting conversations about our reflections on Marx and Marxism. So you wanted to come on today to talk about a number of things, and you actually had read an article written by Vincent. Let me get the title of it. Hold on. The less problem with technology, which I'll put in the description below. And once I read that, I said I want to have Vincent on this episode as well. But you also sent us an article from the Monthly Review. Oh darn it! I don't. What you know what it's called?
Eco-revolutionary tipping point.
Yeah. Okay. And you wanted to use that as the starting point, really, for your own reflections and your own revisiting of elements of Marxism, as I understood it. So I'm just going to kind of like leave it over to you, and then we're just going to take it from there and see where this conversation leads us.
Yeah, Andy, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here with both you and Vincent. And I think that, you and I had planned for a little while to have a conversation. And when I checked out Vincent's most recent Substack, I thought, well, this is exactly, what I would like to focus on in what we're discussing. It just really seemed to hit the nail on the head, and to give people an idea of the kind of topic that we're going to be delving into today. I thought that I might read just one sentence to get us started from a book that I've been cracking open here, Cornelius Castoriadis, who was a member of a Trotskyist or post-Trotskyist group called Socialism or Barbarism in France. He has it says here, under capitalism, changes in labor and in the way it is organized are dominated by two profoundly related tendencies: bureaucratization on the one hand, mechanization, automation on the other. And I had just read that when I took a look at Vincent's Substack and his link to his 2002 article. And he starts out talking about the
was it 2022?
Sorry, 2022. Yeah, not that far back. 2022 article. He starts out talking about the politics of the professional, what some people call the professional managerial class, and about how these tend to be very pro-technology politics. And then he goes on to talk about some of the politics themselves, or the technology itself that's connected to these politics. And it occurred to me that Castoriadis here is pointing out that the existence, the creation, and the propagation of this segment of society that some people refer to as the PMC, the professional managerial class, is linked intimately to that very process of technologization or what have you, right? Because these technologies require experts of a sort to command the operation of these technologies now, and that's so I'd be curious to know what you all think about that, and we can continue talking about the article as well. But it occurred to me that Vincent did such a great job synthesizing so many different things in it, and I saw maybe one more chance for synthesis in this article there. That wow, this PMC class that whose politics Vincent is describing actually have a really integral connection to the technologies themselves and why we're stuck with them. Right.
So. Yeah, and I'm going to go to you next, Vincent. But I think then the professional managerial class has also been associated with sections of the left, and even to some sections of the revolutionary left, is sort of being analogous to the people who compose much of the revolutionary left in the United States. Many of us either come from that kind of place or aspire to that sort of position. So there's a connection between the PMC and just the left in general. There's a critique there as well. Vincent, do you want to take it from there in terms of maybe fleshing out a little bit more what got you to write that article as you remember it, and what are some of the features you'd like to talk about today? And I definitely have some things to say about it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you both for reading the article, and I'm excited to discuss it a while after it came out. I think this was even early 2022, sort of still in the midst of the pandemic response was when I was writing it. But I think one of the main things that prompted me to write it was what you're both getting at here, especially what you just mentioned, Andy, about large segments of the left in the United States and elsewhere often being affiliated with this PMC class, either as far as class background is concerned or aspiration. And at this time, I had also just recently left, I guess you could say, a more traditional left organization, and had, what I guess was probably my final break with that element of what we might call the mainstream left, as you mentioned in the intro to this discussion. So I think both of those contexts, on the one hand, what was going on with the pandemic, and two, what was going on with my personal political trajectory at the time, were both things that prompted me to write this piece. And yes, it's a fairly long piece, so I would encourage people to read it who are listening to this, because it would be difficult to summarize all of the arguments within it. But one of the ones that I think is worth highlighting here, given what both Bo and Andy mentioned just now, is that this class formation that we call the PMC, which is really a term that has come more out of the right as far as people thinking about class analysis. But I think there are certain analogous concepts on the left. I mean, one is the concept of the petty bourgeoisie within the Marxist framework, which I use a little bit in the piece. I also talk about professional leftists, which again is a term that's sometimes been used positively to refer to professional revolutionaries, but also more negatively to refer to, you could say, elements of the petty bourgeoisie that are disconnected from a working class base, but have taken up the mantle of revolution on their own terms. So, I think not all of those concepts are exactly equivalent, and that would probably be a whole other discussion. It's just talking about what these concepts really mean and how they would maybe produce different forms of analysis when we're thinking about contemporary class relations. But I think one of the points I wanted to make in it regarding these class strata is that we saw earlier, at least in the early industrial revolution, for thinking about 19th century Europe and particularly Britain, there was, interestingly enough, a resistance to these new technologies coming both from the working class strata, often in terms of the Luddite movement, which is a major touchstone of the piece, as well as from more of these aristocratic uh, elements of the Conservatives or Tory party at that time that had perhaps more of a uh, romanticization of pre-industrial ways of life, of a pre-capitalist social formation that hadn't yet been taken over by bourgeois class relations. So I think that was something I was thinking about largely in terms of these political realignments that are happening now, where the right and the left have started disintegrating as the political categories that we use them um, as in the 20th century, for example. And I know that's something that has been discussed here on What's Left before. I believe it also came up quite a bit the last time I was on the podcast. So I think, again, there are differences there, especially because the contemporary populist right is not necessarily, well, I would say definitely not associated with some sort of aristocratic social base. You could probably find some exceptions to that, certainly. But the main point there was that there are often these strange bedfellows that can come up in new political realignments and solidarities. And it's worth thinking about that historically as well, not just in the contemporary moment, which I think there's been a lot of writing about that, but it hasn't really been put into dialogue with, okay, what were the situations where something like this might have happened before, where you had different political and class forces aligning in ways that wouldn't necessarily be predicted. And I was especially interested in the question of technology, because that is one where I think we do see this middle strata, oftentimes this aspirational middle class strata, the petty bourgeoisie or professional left or PMC, whatever you want to call it, often taking, as you mentioned, Bo, this very pro-technology stance. But then what has emerged against that and why was one of the questions that I wanted to move towards answering with this piece, and at least start a discussion about.
Yeah, and for me, um, particularly since I I still believe that capitalism is largely the things I describe as a systemic problem that we're dealing with, and I still believe that Marxism is still my political touchstone for trying to describe that system and to lay the basis for the possible like believing we need a revolution. And I would still say that the working class, I still conceive of the working class as a major revolutionary agent among many oppressed classes or oppressed forces under capitalism. But I want to talk about some of the things that have become questions for me about Marx and Marxism as I understand it, that you, in some ways, you touched into it. And yes, the reformist left gets caught in this and things like that. And I'm not trying to call out the revolutionary left. I'm really just trying to say, how do I understand why the revolutionary left, in a sense, it's trying to answer the question, how the revolutionary left got the COVID period so wrong. Because the COVID period wasn't just about, oh, we're going to all line up behind Pfizer, a big corporation. It was also a giant data collection operation that were pretty much completely ignored. Like all the technology that's of data collection and AI development and surveillance that was obvious to me was being strengthened during that time. The left completely ignored that and has ignored that area for quite some time. I kind of had to look at, and I always say the left now. I'm not talking about Democrats. I'm saying the revolutionary left, the socialist left, the Marxists. And so I was trying to answer some questions as to why that is. And here's a few that come to mind. First off, some of the basics of Marxism are the act of revolution is the act of seizing the means of production. And so there's almost like within socialists, I think there's a developed appetite for, like, if we can only get our hands on that wonderful shit that got built and use it for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
As if and Bo, I think, said it, or maybe you said it, Vincent, as if it's neutral shit, as if it's just like a tip ball between two groups, and whoever grabs the basketball gets to win. And I think I saw technology in that way at one point in time, but now I don't. I see that technology, and I don't know how deep it goes. Can we use hammers and still get away with it? But I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's an open question to me how far back I would go, because I definitely would describe myself as a full-on Luddite. In terms of when I think about revolution, I think about probably the need to strip away much of the things that many of these means of production that we are supposedly seizing to then run society that way. And so a question came for me, and when I thought about that, is like, wait, like, does that mean all those people who are organized around Taylor's production got to keep doing that? Like, there was an implication in my opinion, in the Marxism that I was brought up in, that everyone who's kind of doing the shit in the factory that's producing all that great stuff, the socialization of production. They said, oh, it's already been socialized, but socialized in a way that it's brutally destroying workers and forcing us to, like, work in this rotten situation in order to produce. And I'm like, doesn't that have to be called into question? Can't workers say, fuck that, I'm not working like that anymore? Like, wouldn't that be part of revolution? So your socialized production may evaporate the minute revolution happens, right? Like, because we don't want to do that. We don't want to organize ourselves in that way anymore. Like, wouldn't it be up to workers to say that? So those are some questions on the idea of seizing the means of production, the idea that socialization of production that's happening under capitalism is something there ripe for the taking. I don't know if I agree that anymore. And I guess the last thing is that I don't understand, and this is a question for me, because in Bo's thing, where if people read the stuff around the environment that these Marxists were talking about, they understand how deeply alienated labor is in all sorts of different ways, and that one of the ways that Marx talks about alienation is the things that workers produce rise up like demons to get them. Like, they are actually seen. Like, Marx actually talked about the tools that workers make as part of the alienation because it becomes a weapon against them. Well, this is literally what's happening right now. So why would we in any way think we're going to use any of these tools when they are a source of our alienation and dispossession, and particularly AI and things like that, because that's a complete replacement of worker. It's a complete replacement of labor as a human activity. I also know, Bo, you wanted to come into the fossil fuel thing. So those are some of the things I wanted to bring up as basic core questions I now have about Marxism that Vincent really tickled when he wrote that article. And Bo, you kind of were getting at that too when I read that stuff. So just I want to bring that up.
Yeah, I would very much agree with what you're saying there, Andy, and making a lot of the same connections myself. It's like and it's really interesting to also to go back to Marx on this point, like Vincent did, and like I've seen some other people do in particular. And this is something I'm going to have to reread for myself. Is chapter 15 of volume 1 of Capital is about specifically about what Marx calls large scale industry, right? The idea being that there's a development in 3 stages: simple cooperation, I think, something like that, manufacture, and then large scale industry, and talking about how those are arranged in different ways. And in talking about large scale industry, if I'm remembering correctly, Marx identifies that as the point at which there starts to be a transformation from tools to machines, in the sense that a tool is something that you're going to use your own skill that's in your mind or embodied in you, and your own energy, right. That you're using your body to operate a tool, and that kind of gets reversed in large scale industry in these with these machines, which rely not on human energy to operate, but rely on, at least initially, things like wind and water power, but eventually fossil fuels and other sources of energy as well. And that at that point, kind of the operation of the machine becomes something that the human worker has to keep up with. And so you can see how this can wrest control from the workers.
Yes, and that was that area of alienation where Marx would talk about how the machine itself is coming up and coming against the worker itself. Like that was one of the features of alienation I remember hearing about. Yeah.
Right, and so that contradiction or that tension that you're talking about is in there too, because and I think this is one of the solutions that sometimes people who consider themselves Marxists think they have to figure out, like, which Marx was the real Marx, and like, how could he said this about that, but that about that. It's like, well, hey, he was a person, right? And he was thinking deeply about really complicated topics, and maybe he saw more than one side to things, and sometimes the things that he said didn't fit together neatly, and that's okay, right? Like, we can still learn something from his insights. The tool in the hand of the worker becomes the machine, which is driven not by the worker's own muscle power, but by things like fossil fuels. And then the other piece of that is that in addition to the physical movements of the worker being routinized and simplified, the intellectual part of that becomes the job of engineers and managers and scientists, and so there's that connection between technology, the PMC, and then, as you mentioned, Andy, fuels, energy sources. Specifically, my thought is that, like, this degradation of the environment has been going on, and has really accelerated since the end of World War II, is in a way like collateral damage to the war that capitalists wage on workers. That these fuels had to be used to disempower the workers in various situations.
Vincent, you want to say anything, or
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would bring up, and this is one I had forgotten when I thought about, because I'm trying to reflect on why socialists essentially have shackled ourselves to technology and basically have made it that we cannot interfere with capitalist science. We cannot interfere with the development of technology. And so the means of production was one of those. I brought up something else as well, but I'm also remembering, and the socialization of production is a feature of that. That is, workers are all going to have to be working in a factory anyway. You're going to want to be using those tools so you can produce more. So don't get in the way of machinery, because that's creating an efficiency to production that we can use after the revolution. And also a feature of when people talk about, when I remember when talking with Marxists or socialists, them saying the possibility of socialism only exists because the working class, as it is organized right now, can produce so much. Yes, they're talking about the working class, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking all those wonderful machines, all those efficiencies, and even saying things like some of the most difficult tasks can be offloaded to robots and things like that. I remember people saying that we can have robots do some of these things. And so embedded within people's vision of socialism and revolution was kind of an enslavement to the existing technology that capitalists had imposed on workers to produce in order to efficiently produce under capitalism. And so that is also, to me, a feature of why socialists would have essentially aligned with technology and technology companies, in my opinion, before they would align with the working class, in which mandates were being forced on them. So these are the things I'm trying to answer. And at the same time, pose questions that give me deeper things about what I think might be some core tenets of Marxism that might not work. Like, so, that's what I want to talk about. So go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there what both of you said. Just on that point, Bo, that you made about Marx as a human being or individual trying to work through these difficult questions, I think that's a really important one because, obviously something like Capital is a massive work and it wasn't entirely finished and all these things. And I think a lot of times there is this impulse to just find some sort of finality there of, this was the most mature position, as it were. And just what you're mentioning as far as Marx's account of the tool then being transmutated into the machine to be used against the worker, there definitely is that in Marx. And I think, at least in my piece, I also highlight elements where he was critical of the Luddite movement, for example, and I sort of question the wisdom of that critique, where Marx essentially argues that attacking machines themselves was more of a sign of underdeveloped or primitive consciousness among workers who didn't really understand that it was the social relationships of production, social relations of production, not the actual material instantiations of capital and machines or something like that that were the real enemy. Whereas I think there actually was a certain form of developed consciousness there when workers were attacking machines themselves, and maybe that's something we can talk about more as we go along. But I just think that's a really important point you made, that there are multiple sides to these issues and how to think about them. And I think, to Andy's point, how did we get to the stage now, and really quite early on, wherein Marxism as a sort of ideology, that element of technology as being neutral or even being a positive force by default, has become the default within the left, and with Marxism in particular. And I think also within different strands of Marxism that have traditionally seen themselves as bitter enemies. And this is another point I try and make, is that, there's been much to do about, for example, Marxism, Leninism, or Stalinism versus Trotskyism versus Maoism, whatever. But on the questions of technology, these different factions have often been quite united, at least in my appraisal. I'm sure there's been some subtle differences there, but not really within the factions themselves. I think more on account of perhaps individual thinkers. But, how come the contradictions that we often are trained on the left to see as the most important ideologically or strategically um, are often not the ones that seem most important to those of us now who have started questioning this blind worship of technology, which just seems like the basis for a lot of these other disagreements. Okay, we agree on this at least. So now we can get to the real stuff, which is all of these other disagreements, and then turn those into the major points of contention.
Yeah, I think that's, in this regard and in others, I think that one thing that not being part of a sectarian organization anymore has allowed me to do is feel more open to um, different varieties of Marxism, and also different varieties of thought and action more generally. To see that, I guess it's a pretty uh, a fundamental thing to see that some things which I thought were different are actually more similar, and some things which I thought were quite similar are actually quite different, right? So, you know, in the same way that there are, as Vincent was saying, there are divides that we might find more salient now with what we're trying to look into in Marxism, that previous generations of Marxists may not have placed as much importance on, and instead placed more importance on things like Trotskyism versus Maoism versus left communism, etc. There are also different strands among anarchism. Some of them will celebrate technology more, and I think it's probably pretty well known that there's also a strand of anarchism that's quite you know full throated in opposition to a lot of technology. So seeing some that maybe it's not Marxism versus anarchism per se, so much as a certain kind of Marxism and a certain kind of anarchism have an affinity, and a certain kind of, uh, you know, on a different basis.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the fact that I used to read terms like socialization of production and be like, yes, those are a precondition for the possibility of revolution. And now I don't. Now that's a much more complicated. It doesn't feel that way anymore. It's like I don't say to myself, oh, the way that workers are organized is sort of how they're going to be organized after the revolution, but just they'll run it themselves. Because I'm like, my question is, would workers agree to the socialization that's been forced on them under capitalism? And I'm not sure that why they would do that. And I don't see it as a precondition. I don't see that if we're saying they will, then it doesn't seem like liberation. Um, and secondly, the whole thing about seizing the means of destruction versus saying dismantling, like the idea that dismantling the means of production is even out of the question. That's an interesting thing to me. And I think when you brought up in your article, I remember Marx being critical of the Luddites. And my understanding of that was the notion that there's a kind of progression to the development of human history that is related to the class divisions. And in order for a working class to come into birth that is capable of making a revolution, you need to have people have to kind of get out of the way. And that means some of these machines have to be not just tolerated, but they're going to have to be there. Like, you can't take them down because we're counting on a working class developing that's going to use them to be able to make production. and don't get in the way of that history in a sense. And that's what the Luddites were seen as. And again, I have to then call question to that notion of that kind of progression. And it fits, though, that today's socialists also, when they assess socialism versus capitalism as it exists today, even for those who might think the former Soviet Union is some version of socialism, or China, they will often assess it on the basis of its productivity. You will hear that today when people say China's been able to do this much more, and Russia, as it's currently constituted with its state-run industries, is able to do this much more. Socialists hear in that, oh, look, this is a sort of a precursor to showing us that state-run industries are going to be more productive, and therefore that's the kind of thing we want. I believe socialists have fallen into all these various traps that I'm trying to unwind myself from. But at what point, what for me, I don't know at what point do I then say I'm no longer even a Marxist? And that's what sort of the question I'm kind of posing myself as I was reading your thing, Vincent, because so many of the things that Marx was saying there were connected to his vision of the connection between slave relations and feudal relations and capitalism and socialism, and how class divisions kind of condition the inevitability, maybe not of revolution, but the inevitability of the creation of a working class that makes revolution possible. And I think he saw Luddites as getting in the way of producing a working class.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you said something along the lines of, this idea that people just had to get out of the way. And I think that's a really good way to put it. And one of the people I draw on a lot in this article is David Noble's work, who's kind of a left historian of technology, particularly his book Progress Without People, which I think gets to the same point that you're making right now, Andy, of okay, well, there's a certain point in the development of the means of production, or this kind of linear progression towards a socialist or communist society in which human beings need to subordinate themselves to the machine, basically. And I think coming back to this question of sectarianism that we were talking about, and that, Bo, you were just discussing, for me, and this is what I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years, I think from around when I wrote this, perhaps a better way to think about divisions rather than, say, the capitalist world versus the socialist world, or, Trotskyists versus Marxist Leninists, or anarchists versus communists, all these things, is more about how these various tendencies deal with the question of scale. And what do I mean by that? Are we thinking about something that is on the human scale? And I think what really got me thinking about this a lot was COVID. And I know this was very formative for a lot of us, but public health wasn't something I'd thought about very much before that. These kind of issues were just not on my radar, at least in a detailed way. But I think one of the things that really bothered me about how the left just lined up behind the dominant pandemic account was this issue of, okay, well, it's not really about individuals and their in achieving a form of non-alienation, which I think really can only happen on the human level of the human individual. And then that can be, obviously something that relates to a broader form of social non-alienation, but really there's something very subjective about that. I mean, that is one of the things that I really appreciate about the early Marx, is this concern with the subjectivity of the worker and how alienation produces a type of human being that is just not something that we would want as individuals striving for something more. But I guess my point is, and I'm just having trouble articulating this in a very concise way. But there was this approach during COVID of just, okay, well, it's all about, you know, how these very large scale things, the global nature of this, or stopping the spread globally, and all of these things. And that is inherently tied up with these issues of technocracy and bureaucracy that Bo was mentioning in that quote at the beginning. But there was always just this large scale solution to these problems. And I think the question of vaccine injury was, to me, the most egregious example, where these were just dismissed as, well, take one for the team because, who cares if your life was destroyed by the vaccine? Well, we had to do it anyway because that was something that had to be done in the name of the pandemic response or public health, or all of these larger scale issues, where the human scale of, well, what did that actually mean to that individual's life? And can you actually write that off so easily, was just not even a question that people were asking in general, and including on the left. So I think there was a certain sense in which this large scale approach bothered me on a moral, ethical level with regard to the vaccine issue. But I think we see it more broadly with how the left relates to technology in general. And if we think more about something like a vaccine as a technology, I think it becomes clearer why those things come together, as far as, the left in general having this very pro-tech disposition, historically, with many exceptions. I mean, I think those really shouldn't be downplayed, and I try to highlight those actually in the article, not just the Luddites, but even 20th century thinkers like Jimmy Boggs or even Martin Luther King Jr. as being examples of people who I think were actually, perhaps due to their own racial alienation, if you will, from elements of the dominant 20th century left, actually were more free to think about these questions of technology than a lot of leftists who perhaps felt more of a need to toe the party line, as it were, whatever that may have been during that time period.
Another connection I would make is to the work of Harry Braverman. Degradation of Work in the 20th Century, I think, is the name of his book. And so he's a Marxist, but he very much draws on, I believe, firsthand experience in factory work to talk about its things like de-skilling. Vincent, what you said made me think of two things that are maybe I don't know. I'm just playing with these ideas here, but one thing is, you're talking about the global scale and the idea of like, well, this is a global issue, so take one for the team because this is a global issue. One thing that occurs to me with being newly critical of technology is that it makes the impossibility of socialism in one country that much more apparent, right? Because if we're saying that socialism has to be democratically technological, meaning that like the technology, not saying there can't be any or we have to use it all, but that people will decide what suits them, then that's fine for that society. But if there's still a portion of the planet that is operating on the top-down techno-science model, they're going to be that top-down techno-science model is going to be able to defeat militarily, if nothing else, our happy socialists who are, like Marx's quote, like fishing in the afternoon and reading in the morning, or what, I can't remember, but it's a very pleasant lifestyle that he's describing for a future society, right? But if you're trying to create that at the same time that something like the United States is trying to invade you, then you've got that much more of a problem. And I mean, it reminds me of Trotsky creating the Red Army, and the fact that in State and Revolution, Lenin talks about replacing standing militaries with the armed workers, right? But then very quickly, it's like, okay, maybe that's not going to work because the armed workers aren't going to be able to stand up to 14 imperialist countries invading. So it just kind of it brings out even more of the the global scale of the problem. And then on the other side of that, seeing like that kind of take one for the team mentality, I think that might also not be a problem of scale either when I think of it, because I'm thinking of some of the major problems with left organizations, and these are not, even the biggest one, DSA, right, is like, well, it's certainly less than 100,000 people, right? I don't know how many people it is, but nothing like a state, right? But even in these relatively tiny organizations, you get people thinking and acting very instrumentally and using other people and not caring about so I mean, one of the things that made me leave the organization that I was in is that people were being treated badly, and then one of the higher ups was I was saying I'm real, this isn't sitting well with me how people are being treated, and I feel like you're not talking about it honestly in public, right? And this person said, well, this is politics. Right. And my thought was, well, that's not a kind of politics that I want to be involved in, So that kind of, I think that instrumentalism, that treatment of people as a means to an end, can happen even in a very small organization. And that there are certain like game theoretical pressures in a larger context of like a revolution in a country or something. So I don't know, all that is just to say, like, man, it's tough. I don't know.
Well, I think all of us have stories of this within various left organizations in the past, of this kind of behavior. I do wonder, though, Bo, if some of it, I totally agree it can happen in small organizations, and certainly ones that are far smaller than something like DSA. But I do wonder, besides some of these just being, at risk of sounding like some sort of essentialist, certain elements of just human interaction, it's certainly not limited to left organizations.
Right.
However, I think the causes in different types of organizations are often different, and those have to be parsed out. And I think where I do think it has to do with scale on the left is that when somebody's saying, well, this is politics to you, for instance, I think part of that is the assumption that, well, we're part of this larger scale thing that's really about this global revolution or world socialist movement. Therefore, what's happening on this interpersonal level between you and me, or in our tiny little, leftist group, doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because we're really part of this larger thing. So while these issues and dynamics can certainly play out on a small scale, I think in the case of leftists, there is this kind of ideology in the background there that, well, maybe we're small, but really we're part of this larger thing. So individual human beings don't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. And because we're fellow travelers with this great, noble, global, world historic movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking of, Vincent, when you said it's a question of scale, um, was and you spoke about alienation in relationship to individuals having to subordinate themselves to the mass, to the global issues. And I do think that's true. Like that, or well, actually, the way I looked at it, I'm not sure if I put it in terms of alienation. To me, that just looked like part of in the absence of mandates, which weren't pushed yet. We're going to get you to do this. So we're just going to say the globe is doing it. You're going to get in line. Oh, you're not getting in line. Now we're just going to make it a rule, you know? And so that's how I took that, at least initially. And I do think it leads to a sort of alienation. It certainly led to separation from me, from people who decided to essentially go with the way the globe was going, if you will, or that the way we're told the globe was going. What it raised for me was a riddle that I have always thought that has been more difficult for me to answer, in terms of how is a revolution going to happen? Because for me, I see alienate. I believe, like, I believe humans are in part need each other, and there's a social component to being human. So part of our humanity is social, and I do believe part of our humanity is individual, is not. And my question I've had is, what is the actual true relationship between being part of a collective and being an individual? And that that same answer is, in a revolutionary society, there's going to have to be an answer about what is the relationship between global political goings on or needs, or requirements, and the requirement of honoring freedom and liberty for the individual. Like, where do those two come together? And here's an answer that partly I come to, and it has to do with, for me, the heyday of some of the best things of following the Russian Revolution. What I remember reading about was that there had been Russian revolutionaries, anarchists and Marxists, for quite some time. Anarchists behaved a little bit differently than Marxists in terms of where they did and where they thought the locus of making a revolution was happen. But all of them are committed to, like, taking down the czar. And now I'm talking about more than 100 years ago. And there had been a long tradition of Marxist organizing and anarchist organizing, sometimes together, sometimes not. They had papers of their own and things like that. And at the turn of the century, I remember hearing how there was various attempts to forge linkages of these revolutionary mushrooms together, and it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen because these revolutionary kernels had their own identity and were like, we don't feel a need to form. We don't feel a need to be under an umbrella. So we're just doing our own thing. Like, so revolutionaries who tried to build a national Russian social democratic organization of some sort were unsuccessful. It didn't happen until the group said, yes, we want to do this. We're going to stop making our own papers per se, and we're going to be part of this broader thing. Like, it's a submission, but it's them choosing to do it. There was no power to make them do it, because no power could be imposed. And so for me, the formation of the initial Russian Social Democratic Party, which happened just prior to the first revolution, 1905, is maybe a model for the relationship between the individual and the collective. Because, and the thing I would say about it is, those calling for a collective need, a need to come together, had no ability to impose it. It had to be something where people were like, yeah, I'm ready to get rid of my small paper. I'm ready to see what this editorial board will put together, and I'm ready to help give these papers out because I see the need. I want to be part of this. Like, I'm in. And being in, then, and if you read stories about the Russian Social Democratic, I mean, the Bolsheviks essentially, and possibly the Mensheviks, you will hear that in the days prior to revolution, the Bolshevik Central Committee said, here's what we think we should do. And then other groups who were part of the Russian Social Democratic Party would just do what they wanted to do. They'd hear it, but they were like, no, we don't agree with that. We're going this way. And there's just, you had to deal with it because they could not impose any discipline on them because they weren't structured to do so. Later, that changed, and later, taking power and having to keep power became the basis in the context of the capitalist counter offensive, the white armies and things like that. became the basis for like, all right, we can't really stick with this principle of democracy any longer. We gotta like, you're gonna have to give up on this thing. We wanted to have, people deciding things at work. Well, now we're gonna impose a manager there because it's just we're not able to produce enough any longer for the war. And so those are the things I think about in terms of like, but I've never experienced it. But I do think it's a riddle that any revolution will have to solve of the relationship between the need to become a collective to fight for the world you want and still and still retaining the notion of individual liberty within that. Because I feel like if you don't retain individual liberty within a collective struggle for revolution, I'm not sure I believe in that project. I don't. I mean, I just think there's a relationship there, but I don't know what it is.
Well, Andy, what you say about like the kind of the option to go your own way um, um, kind of reminds me of how people lost the option to go their own way under capitalism, right? Because, like, as bad as some of the previous forms of class society were, there were various ways to potentially opt out. I mean, obviously, not everyone who wanted to was able to, but there were various ways to subsist outside of the dominant society. And now that we live in a truly global capitalist economy, it's got to be extremely hard to subsist
And
outside. And so people, yeah, go ahead.
and the British enclosure laws are part
Right.
of what made that impossible. Something the
Yeah.
Luddites were running up against themselves.
Yeah. So it feels analogous to me, kind of, like this, um, you know, um, capture of people.
So here's what I guess I feel after this entire discussion, which is for me been a discussion about Marxism, a discussion of the relationship between technology and our future, the relationship between technology and revolution, and then talking about, for me, these questions of social versus individual speak to again how does a revolution even happen? Um, what comes up for me is kind of something you mentioned, Bo, which is after I left the ISO, um, and after I left a group where my horizons on political thought were being narrowed intentionally, um, things were opened up, and it allowed me to look more critically at assumptions I had made, and like this is the same thing that happened during the COVID narrative. I consider myself a scientist, but I have a very different view of science now than I did 4 years ago. And I consider myself a Marxist, I think, but I'm almost unconvincing myself during the course of this conversation. Um, but there's these threads that I pull at that I don't have answers to. And I'm uncomfortable with it, but I think I have to say I'm just going to be okay with not knowing an answer to something that I thought I used to have an answer to. The only thing I know, I believe, is there's going to have to be a revolution. It's going to require a bunch of us, like the majority of people, and we're going to sign on to this thing for reasons that of our own volition. It's not going to be out of forced compulsion. Um, and I believe that's going to be necessary, or else I do believe humanity is largely going to find itself not eradicated, but leveled by, I believe, a nuclear war. Because I believe that's inevitable because I do believe capitalism is a system. So I think what's been interesting for me is to see how many deep questions I have about a framework that I still hold to, but to watch the holes and the water leak out, that's a difficult thing to do. So it's uncomfortable, but I'm just going to have to get used to it. And I think in this discussion, I was hoping either Vincent would have an answer for me or Bo would have an answer, and none of you guys came to my rescue. And but I think I'm just going to have to deal with that and live with it and know that this is a changing thing. Like my views of what I believe is true constantly change, and that's difficult sometimes. So that's what's come up for me. But I've enjoyed speculating about these things with you, because I've wanted to be honest about, like, I want to be honest with you too, but I also, if we have viewers, I do believe it's going to be necessary for people to be honest with themselves about what they believe and don't believe, and honest with each other if we're going to get through this. That's a thing I do believe in. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think to come back to the question, I want to come back to the question of scale in relation to what you're saying, Andy, because I think maybe one of the ways to get at this issue of what are the internal contradictions within Marxism is to look at other closed systems, if you will, or other kind of ideological tendencies that are maybe operating independently but in a similar way. And one of the ones I was thinking about before our conversation in relation to some of these various articles, and also in relation to this broader question of realignment, because I think all of us are looking for connection outside of a bubble and have put aside these sectarian allegiances within the left, and even with regard to the left in relation to the right or other things like that. So I think that's something that we all share in common. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that, we're looking for sort of perhaps unexpected allies in this contemporary moment. But one of the ones that comes to mind, at least because I do a lot of reading on Substack and other independent platforms, but I think there's been a recent rise on the right around people, say, like Paul Kingsnorth, if you're familiar with his work, who kind of came out of the more radical environmental movement and kind of deep ecology and things like that. And then basically became very skeptical of the COVID regime, then converted to Christianity, and has had kind of a large following around these various trajectories. And I think because he became Eastern Orthodox and started aligning with kind of a conservative rendering of Christianity, although not in a stereotypical way at all. I don't want to misrepresent that. I think he's been a very independent thinker on that. The people who have coalesced around this kind of thinking have broadly been more on the right, so to speak. Again, putting that in quotations because I think we know that there are limitations to just pigeonholing things like that. But one of the things that I've appreciated about his writing has been this attention to making change on smaller scales, thinking about what the human being means and all of this type of stuff. And the people surrounding him, I think there's been a lot that you could put in that camp, and I won't give a whole list right now, but I just to say that I think that this is actually an identifiable ideological tendency at this point, which is kind of this tech critical, right tech critical tendency. But my issue with them, and at risk of contradicting what I said earlier, but maybe it's in the spirit of what you're talking about, of being okay with some of these uh, unsettled questions, if you will, just as Bo was mentioning with regard to thinking about Marx himself, not everything was entirely worked out. I think a problem I've had with this kind of tech critical right, that's been very critical of Western decadence and the COVID regime and all these other things, is that they really don't engage with any global issues, as it were, other than perhaps the pandemic. But after that, for instance, I have not seen these people comment in any substantive way, for example, on the Israel's genocide in Palestine, for instance, or the broader war in the Middle East. And I think for those of us who have come out of this left or Marxist framework, those issues are also near and dear to our heart. The idea that you can sort of reform yourself and become this non-alienated individual purely through you know removing tech from your personal lives, or finding the kind of spiritual substrate to material discontent, that really kind of the spiritual lies behind these material problems, all this type of stuff. While there's truth in all that, I think there's a real risk of going in the opposite direction, where it's just, okay, I don't care about these issues anymore. I'm just going to focus on myself and my immediate community. So again, just to really reiterate what you're saying, Andy, in different terms, I think that dialectic, as it were, between the individual and the social, or the smaller scale and the larger scale, comes up in many ways. And we can't just cut one off from the other. And oftentimes, I think it depends on what's going on contextually, what's being emphasized too much. It can often sound like holding two different positions depending on who you're talking to. But I think that's less an issue of contradiction or hypocrisy as it is that there's, in the public sphere, radically different approaches to these issues right now, and people often find themselves gravitating towards one extreme or the other. So again, just thinking about the need, if not an answer to these questions, the need to move towards an answer, to how to reconcile these various domains or scales, that seem so important simultaneously, but don't seem to be of interest to the same people. I mean, it's almost heretical to be interested in the large scale and the small scale. I will say for myself personally, I think that large scale questions need to be resolved, at least on an ethical level, with reference to smaller scales. Because I think once you start dealing with the global or the public and all these things as kind of the base DNA of your politics or morality, I think it really is a slippery slope into some very dangerous things. I think just the COVID regime being a prime example, but there have been many others throughout history. But that's not to say that the global shouldn't be addressed, right? We have to be thinking about these issues. I think anyone who is not attentive, for example, to what's going on, to the Palestinian people, is really abdicating responsibility in a major way. And to do that under the guise of, well, I'm just going to focus on my local context, I think really is a betrayal, on a quite major scale.
Well, Vincent, you brought up some interesting things here at the end. I think could I'd be curious to talk more to you about some of these things. Like in particular, I don't know too much about Kingsnorth, but I think that he used to be an environmental activist, basically, and is so I think that kind of and that he subsequently questioned his environmental activism, and was it successful and things like that. I think that process of questioning is very similar to what's been going on for at least Andy and myself about the left and socialist activism. So that's an interesting parallel. I think that that we have to be okay with continuing to think these things through as best we can. I mean, in fact, we're pretty lucky to have the opportunity to think these things through. We'll do the best we can. I know that I think that that you guys and Andy, your channel here is presenting a place for people to try to think things through together.
Yeah.
And I think that is really valuable. And I think that's what the three of us have done here today is think some things through together. And if we haven't reached a final conclusion, that's fine. And I think it's productive because we're trying to figure out where we are in this thing. you know. So I really appreciate being here with both of you. Andy, I really appreciate your show and the many people that you've had on, and Vincent. I would really encourage anybody listening to check out Vincent's article, "The Left's Problem with Technology" from 2 years ago. It's really a must read.
Yeah, and Vincent, you've had a few must reads, and there's some things on there that were on the thread below that I became very interested, like the stuff about the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who's somebody whose writings me and Brandy revisited. We're like, this guy had some things to say that were very interesting. So here's what I guess where we'll leave it is, Bo, I appreciate the fact that you've been regularly reaching out to me with just thinking about question this, question that. But I just want to make a standing invitation to Vincent, you, and Bo, you, when there becomes something you're like, hey, I want to talk about this on What's Left. Can we do that? Please do that, because both of you have gotten me thinking about things, not just today, but in the past. So that is something that I really, really value. So definitely consider yourself part of the team here. And it's just about when we can find the time to hit that particular issue. So I hope you both feel welcome here anytime, but we have my email. And if there's something you'd like to talk about, I would love to do it here on What's Left, including the question of what are all things can be discussed offline. We don't have to record every goddamn thing we say, but I actually do want to have my own view as really there's no reason to hide anything. Like there's Brandy's business, there's my business, personal stuff. But
Right.
politically, I really want to not feel like, wait, do I want to talk about this in public? Now, people can be worried about an employer, state, whatever. But
Right.
in terms of offending someone, in terms of, I'd like to move away from that because that was the history that I came from prior to What's Left of self-censorship and things like that. So for me, I tend to want to be like, let's bring it open. Let's talk it out in the open and see where it goes. If somebody has an issue, they can come and tell us, and then we can have a conversation with them. So I'm just really glad to talk with you guys. I'm really glad I've gotten to know you. I lost a lot of relationships, not tight relationships, but people I knew politically since 2020. I feel like the ones I've found since then have been people who've really forced me to think much more deeply than I did prior to 2020, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on again, Andy. I really appreciate it. I'm a little disconnected from things here across on the other side of the world sometimes, so it's really nice to have these conversations as well, with people like both of you. And I was thinking a lot about the conversation we also had over the summer, since then. So it's nice to revisit some similar topics here as well. And yeah, thank you for, keeping up this space. It's really hard to be consistent with this type of thing. So, I know that I know how much work that takes to do that kind of thing, especially when you're hosting other people and putting this kind of content out.
Yeah, Bo was saying, man, you guys have been doing this for a while, and it's like since 2018 May, this will be our 332nd episode, pretty much weekly. But I have gotten a lot out of it. It's given me more than it's taken. That's all I can say, and that's pretty meaningful. And Bo, again, thanks for making sure we finally got you on What's Left.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, let me sign off here. That does it for this week's. Well, again, thank you, gentlemen. That does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog. whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. If you want to reach out to us about ideas for future episodes, feel free to use that link to contact us at What's Left directly. I remind you, if you like anything you heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 7 platforms on Spotify, iTunes, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. And if you'd like to give us feedback or something you heard about something you've heard, or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. So again, thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Bo. And coming from India, from somewhere out the East Coast, and here from the Bay Area. Thanks, folks, for listening, and we'll see you next week.